Well, let's continue our conversation around President Bola Tinubu's signing the 2025 appropriation bill, which was passed by the National Assembly into law. The president signed the budget at a ceremony at the State House in Abuja. That was on Friday. The report shows that the National Assembly passed the 54.9 trillion naira budget on the 13th February, with an increase of about 750 billion naira from the 54.2 trillion proposed by the president. Further adjustments were made on the budget on the 18th February to correct allocation errors affecting some federal ministries, departments, and agencies of government. Now, with the adjustment, the budget has an allocation of 13.5 trillion naira for recurrent non-debt expenditure, 23.4 trillion naira for capital expenditure, and 3.6 trillion naira for statutory transfers, 14.3 trillion naira for debt servicing, and 23.9 trillion naira for capital expenditure, and 13.8 trillion naira for fiscal deficit. It is President Bola Tinubu's second full budget since he assumed office. Again, let's talk to Mr. Abiodun Kayode-Alli. Is an economist and tax senior manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers to dive deep into details of this ambitious spending plan. He's seated already, like you can see there. Let me join him to talk about this. Mr. Abiodun, it's good to have you in the studio. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Yes, like we would always say, an ambitious budget, about 99% higher than what we had last year. So what is your take with all of the projections actually to raise funds to make this happen? Well, how is it coming to you?
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting, and it's quite bold, a bold move by the current administration. And like we've said, this administration is actually interested in making big changes, right? They've taken moves that we've not seen past administrations take, right? So they're actually looking forward to making an impact, and with key focus on the welfare of citizens, right? So if you consider the fact that they've come up back again with some of the measures to actually relieve most of the impact of the removal of the subsidy, as well as also the liberalization of the exchange rate. So we have funds that are now allocated to Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, right? So these are measures that this administration is looking at. And like you said, look at some of the assumptions, right? Trying to bring down inflation rates, trying to increase the GDP growth rate, right? So these are some of the things they are looking at. And I think this increase is actually good, and there is that confidence that they're actually going to make revenues to actually back up this spending. Historically, most of the amounts, what we've seen is that most of the amounts generated in terms of revenue, a huge chunk of it has actually been used for debt servicing. So if you also look at the medium-term expenditure framework for 2025 to 2027 that was released, we're able to see that from the 2023 fiscal year, about 70% of the revenue that was generated was actually used for debt servicing, right? So that's actually a very, it's not too nice. It speaks a lot to how we've managed most of our funds in times past, right? About 60% of the expenditure itself was still used for debt servicing if you take that proportion, right? So it simply means that, yes, it's important to need to borrow, especially for capital infrastructure, but all the same, as much as possible, we should ensure that those monies that are borrowed are actually used for that purpose. This increase of 55 trillion, the increase is actually coming from capital expenditure, and that makes a lot of sense, considering that the government is trying to go big with a lot of infrastructure, road infrastructure, with a lot of power infrastructure and the likes. So I do think it's actually a good move. Though if you look at it from a dollar terms, you still would not be able to compare it with some of our neighboring countries like South Africa. If you compare this budget of 55 trillion in dollar terms, that's 55 trillion, that's about $30 billion, right? South Africa is doing 125. That's about 4 times more than what we have. So we still need to spend more, but the most important thing is that we spend it well. That way, if we're able to spend it well, we can attract investments, we can expand productivity. And once you're able to do that, you generate enough revenue to finance subsequent projects in the future. You no longer need to borrow. And I think one key thing the government is trying to do also is to double down on external borrowings. Given the fact that the Naira has depreciated. That won't look well in the long run. But so far, so good. I think it's a commendable move by the administration.
Looking at what you just alluded to, South Africa's budget, look at their population, far less than 100 million. And Nigeria, we are like 200 million, more than 200 million.
Definitely.
And
I think,
look at the budgets, you know?
Yeah, I think it's even in, there is a state, one of the states in the U.S., I think Georgia, Illinois, those states, they have budgets in terms of dollars, about $30 billion, about $50 billion. And if you look at their budget per capita, compared with their population, they are doing about $3,000, right, per citizen that the budget is spent on. In Nigeria, we have $150. If you compare it to our population, that's $150 per person. So that's almost like, you're looking at almost like 20 times, right? That's what they have in terms of budget per capita. So we actually need to invest more in terms of what we spend, right? And not more in terms of quantity, but more in terms of quality, right? So if you look at Nigeria, back in 2001, Nigeria was one of those countries that was going to be seen as doing growth rate, GDP growth rate, similar to double digits, what we had in China. And that was why we had this term that was coined, called the mint, right? Looking at mint countries like Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. So one thing that was said by the British economists who came up with that term was that within the next 5 to 10 years, if Nigeria could get its act together, we would actually be experiencing double-digit growth. But getting our act together, well, the past is the past. We just have to look forward to the future, right? So it's expected that if we can stay the course, right, if we can keep doing things, the right things, putting the right policies in place, and ensuring its adequate implementation, we should go far with respect to GDP growth and with respect to productivity.
The past year really tested our resolve, you know, looking at the economic reforms undertaken by this present administration. Now, would you also say that the worst is over? We're getting to a point where even price of PMS, as of today, is about 860 Naira. You know, there's that the deregulated market, and everyone is also talking about the price of foodstuff. There's a bit of, you know, reduction that we've seen, and everyone is alluding to all of this. So will you also agree that it seems like the worst is over?
Well, I definitely, yes, we can say that. We can say that. The indicators we are looking at, they actually speak to positives, right? They actually speak to positives. If you look at it in terms of what are the assumptions that we'll typically be looking at, if you look at the macroeconomic indicators, things like the foreign exchange, the exchange rate, right? So the exchange rate has relatively been stable, right? So you can say that the import of items, which are coming, either items for consumption or items for production, they are relatively cheaper compared to at the start of last year, right? So to that extent, there is positives, right? And also if you consider the fact of the recent CPI rebasing, right? Look at the move taken by the current Monetary Policy Committee at their last meeting. They decided to actually hold rates, right? If not for, I want to believe if not for the CPI rebasing, we might have seen instances of a hike in rates, and this actually speaks to an increase in the cost of production, right? So if you then also consider the fact that inflation, even though costs are high, we are able to make adequate moves. We're able to, businesses, investors, as well as the authorities, they're able to make adequate decisions based on the correct figure we're getting from the rebasing. It's like we're looking at things from a proper lens compared to what we were having before. Then also, if you look at it in terms of security, we've not had as much cases of insecurity as we had before, right, in previous years. So these are some of the things that we are looking at that are actually bringing down prices of food items. And you also want to consider the seasons that we're in currently, even though we know that the current Ramadan, we will see prices come up a little, but we've seen security. Farmers are able to go to their farm, are able to produce, and the government has actually done much in terms of intervention, in terms of providing them with inputs that they can use to increase production. So I think so far so good. I think we can say the worst is behind us. We can.
Pretty stuff there. Naira is also rebounding. There's a bit of strength coming back to our currency. We must say that, and I think that's also affecting PMS and all of this. And also the minimum wage has been raised, and governors are paying, because we see that you know, and that's also impacting on all of this. And also that Naira and the Forex thing, which has always been what we've talked about. You know how long we've talked about this on this show. It seems that there's been a bit of stability, if I can use that word, in recent times. Well, what do you make of it?
You can see, if you look at global crude oil prices, right?
Yes.
Global crude oil prices are beginning to stem down a little, kind of moderating, thanks to increased production from the United States, right? And like Trump's policy is to ensure that oil companies drill as much as possible, right? So to that extent, you expect that the price of PMS would actually stabilize, right? And also thanks to the policy environment that has been put in place by the current administration, whereby we have that competition, right? We've seen that even the NNPC Limited has actually also brought down its price, right, in order to compete with the private sector. So this kind of competition is also what is actually causing the price of PMS, right, to actually come down. But then you talked about an increase in or the stability in the price of the Naira, thanks to some of the policies that the CBN has actually put in place, some of the policies that ensure transparency, right, that those who are actually demanding for FX, they are people with legitimate needs, unlike what we've seen in the past, speculative activities. And you know one interesting thing, the more the Naira begins to appreciate, the less of speculation we have, because the environment seems to be supporting the appreciation of the Naira. And so also part of the things that the CBN has done is also attracting foreign portfolio investment, right? The CBN has cleared its backlogs, right? And there is that transparent window to actually encourage even people in our colleagues in the diaspora, right, to actually bring in their funds through normal channels. So I think a lot of these measures are actually good. Then the fiscal policy also, the reform bills that has been much debated and has received a public hearing. Some of the content, some of the provisions actually seek to stop arbitrage, whereby when it does come into effect, whereby if anyone is actually going into speculative activities, you are buying at the official rate and selling in order to gain a kind of advantage, you would be paying excise duty on that difference. So we've seen the Monetary Policy Authority as the fiscal side come together to ensure that the Naira actually reaches its true value. So I do think that there is actually light at the end of the tunnel in terms of our currency.
Pretty stuff there, looking like our currency is getting appropriately priced moving forward.
And one other thing I didn't say also is that Nigeria is actually doing well in terms of crude oil production. That's true. So production is actually helping.
It's also high, and we're also getting some greenback from that end too. Well, let's look at capital expenditure at 23.96 trillion naira and recurrent at 13.64. It looks like there's a focus on capital expenditure. Government really wants to, revamp infrastructure and all of that. How does that also come to you?
And I think it's actually a good move because it has the impact of the investment in capital expenditure. The multiplier effect is way more than what we see in terms of the current expenditure, right? Because there are lots of routes that actually, if you consider the fact that about 900,000 kilometers of road. If the impact of transportation to the GDP of an economy, it said its impact is about 5% to the Nigerian GDP. So if we can actually deal with road infrastructure, railway infrastructure, right, to a large extent, even port infrastructure, to a large extent, we'll see that productive activities are moving as they ought to, right? It's definitely going to increase productivity. Power also is also one other thing. The same way we see competition, the same way we see things thriving in the oil sector in terms of crude oil refining, I would also like to see something similar in the energy sector. Given the fact that there's been privatization, right, of the energy sector, we want to see that competition, right, such that a lot of people have power, especially those who are going into productive sectors, productive activities like the small and medium scale businesses, right? We have states like Abia State, Geometric, actually having constant power supply, right? We want to see more investment across the whole I think
that's what the Electricity Act is supposed to push.
That's exactly what it's meant to do. But we're not seeing that much of an impact, right, as we are seeing in crude oil, or as we're in crude oil refining, or as we saw in telecoms. We want to see more of that.
I get your point.
We actually want to see more of that. To a large extent, that's going to spur economic activities. And before you know it, you would see a lot of investment, you see a lot of export, you see a lot of inflows from the non-oil exports, not just the oil exports, because most of the oil exports that we have, they are still in their crude form, right? We want to do more in terms of non-oil exports. And for the agricultural commodities that we export, we want to see a lot of transformation, right? So I do think that investment in capital infrastructure would go a long way. The only but I have, right, is in terms of the implementation, in terms of the achievement. Capital infrastructure, as I looked at an average of 4 years, from 2021 to 2024. In terms of implementation, in terms of achievement, our outturn, it has just been at the range of 55%, right, compared to recurrent. Recurrent has been 98%, right, or an average of 4 years. So I think we need to do more in terms of, it's okay to budget, to plan, but in terms of releasing those funds, right, giving contractors, letting them have access to those funds early on, I think that goes a long way in actually solving most of these problems that we have.
And that's really key, what you just alluded to. It's key to release those funds and let projects go on, you know, and so that at the end of the day, we actualize what this budget is for. Government is talking about inclusive growth, and that is key, you know, anytime we talk about it.
So to add to that, you know, the interesting thing is that we have the National Development Plan, 2021 to 2025. It ends this year, and it's the idea behind that National Development Plan was actually to spur investment in capital infrastructure, right? And a total of about 298 trillion was expected to be spent. And out of that 298 trillion, the private sector is expected or has been expected to move 248 trillion. And the only way you can go about it is by creating that enabling environment, right? Show them that, okay, we come up with policies, and whatever policies we come up with, we are not going to change it. There's not going to be a flip-flop, right, in subsequent time. So I do think government can't do it on its own. Government doesn't have all the funds. It definitely needs the private sector. So a lot more needs to be done in terms of encouraging investment in the country, letting them know that their funds are actually secured, and government is not going to go back on any of its policies or come with any unexpected policies.
That would change things. No, shifting the goalpost when the march has started. That won't be very good. Well, let's wrap up this conversation looking at debt service. You know, we always have to talk about that because it's pretty important so that we know where we're headed. What do you make of the figures to service debt in this budget? Like you alluded to, government is looking at more of domestic borrowing, you know, and not more of external. But considering what we even have on ground and this debt service for this project?
Yeah, well, you know, the interesting thing is that the deficit that we have from the budget, the deficit was in excess of about 13 trillion, right? 13 trillion, in excess of that. The interesting thing is that out of that 13 trillion, you have about 69% coming from further borrowings, right? 69%, almost 70% coming from further borrowings. 2% is coming from privatization. I would like to see more than 2%, right? Whereby you have this equity, this model where you have the private sector also controlling most of these government assets, because government has shown historically that might not be the best in terms of managing these assets, right? Something similar to what we have in the NLNG model. I think that will be very, very efficient.
Many have commended that model.
It works perfectly, right? It distributes dividend. In fact, it's the best asset that gives government dividends, right? And it helps government in times of need. So I do think as much as possible, if government is trying to go into borrowing, one other important thing government should be looking at should be equity, right? Selling down on most of its assets. About has to do with multilateral tied loans, bilateral tied loans, which come at a concession. So yes, government needs to do more of local investment, and I think this is a good opportunity for investors, for even Nigerians, to actually invest right now, especially given the fact that interest rates are actually attractive. So I do think that government should, as much as possible, pay down most of its existing interest, external debt interest, and focus more on generating equity, getting most of the private sectors to actually buy most of its existing assets. I think that's one key thing that we need to do in order to reduce that debt burden. Currently, the last time I checked, the debt stock is like in excess of 150 trillion. Right? That's quite a lot. I do think we need to get more of the private sector to actually own most of these assets that government has. I think that will go a long way. And if government has to borrow, I think government has to do a lot with respect to transparency, letting people see the impact of the borrowings, right? What is it? Are the monies being spent on? I know one thing that the Fiscal Policy Committee are going to work on immediately they are done with the tax reform bills is to now work on fiscal spending, right? Coming up with policies that direct how money should be spent. We don't want to see government spending money on libraries, right? In a particular libraries that can only be accessed by only a few. We want to see something like online libraries, because human education is something we need in these times, right? Something like online libraries, that would make a lot of sense. So there needs to be a definition of what should constitute a public good. And the same way we're having all this public hearing, all this committee hearing on the tax reforms, we also want to have something similar with respect to government spending, where you can ask questions and you can challenge and bring up suggestions. I think that's one thing that we should actually look forward to with respect to spending.
All right, brilliant stuff there. I must thank you, as always, for coming on the show. Mr. Abiodun Kayode-Alli is an economist and tax senior manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers, making real sense of this spending plan. Let's see what happens, and as we also expect the rebased GDP figures to come up very, very soon. Your expectations in regards to that?
Well, I know definitely we're going to be bigger. That definitely we're going to be bigger. That I can say.
I must thank you so much for your time on the program. It's
too.
good to have you in there. Well, still to come on the program, we'll shift our focus to geopolitics.